Well, hello, Petra. It's so lovely to see you. You're in Queensland and I'm in Melbourne today. And we used to both be in Melbourne. I miss you here. And we were just talking about how you've just moved up and how you're setting a community up around you. And it's not always easy to do that. It's something, yeah. So, hello.
Yeah, hi. It's so lovely to see you and chat to you, but virtually. Yeah, I do
Yeah.
Melbourne and catching up in person, and it's very different.
Yeah, it is. Anyway, luckily we can see each other in Bali very soon. Like it's a couple of months away now, so it's getting very excited. I wanted to introduce you. I wanted to spend a bit of time so that people get to know you, they get to know me, and maybe even just how this all started for us because we've been working together on feminine power and empowerment, particularly on the retreats for is it 2 years? I was thinking whether it was 2 or 3 years. I think it's 2 years.
2.5, I would say. So it's
Yeah,
coming
maybe
up
two and a half.
to three. Yeah.
And we've been friends for longer than that. And I know that you've got a real beautiful passion for helping people, but particularly women. And I've got a passion for advocating for women. And we come from similar places in terms of a background in psychology, but also very different places.
Hmm.
So maybe spend a bit of time just telling us why you work in this area. What is it about your work that links to your values and where's the meaning for you in this work?
I guess with any meaning, you relate it to your own experience and to yourself. And I've always believed that you can only be, as a whether you work as a coach or a psychologist or in that kind of health sphere, you can only be a good practitioner if you went through things on your own. Of course, our education gives us a lot. We can learn about different types of therapies that we can provide, and we can become a good skilled therapist. But unless we've gone through specific experiences ourselves, then
Mm,
it's really difficult for us to relate to those who are seeking the need
mm-mm.
or help or support. I'm a woman. I can see in the world through the lenses of a woman. So it's the most logical step for me to work with women and
Yeah.
help them to navigate the life and all the messiness that comes with it.
Mm-mm.
I've always been interested in, all feminine topics. Like as you said, we have a very similar passions as well with
Yeah.
dancing, connecting with women.
Mm.
And I think growing up as well, when I'm reflecting, being around other women or girls at that time was so
Mm.
important for me, and it was so natural. And I always wanted to create circles.
Yeah.
And I've been naturally doing that since I was 5 years old. We would go outside with all the girls, sit on a blanket and talk and play.
Yes.
And that continued through its teenage years as well.
Mm-mm.
And so, yeah, that's always been very close to my heart. Working with women, sharing our struggles, elevating each other and helping each other. Yeah.
And I love that. I can just imagine you as a 5-year-old leading a girls' circle. I can just see that encouraging everybody. But yeah, and for me too, I think I agree with you. I think, education can only get you so far. That experience you have in life is really important. And, by the time you get to a certain age, most of us have experienced one or two things. And at the time when we go through that stuff, it's hard. But I always think contrast makes you stronger. It's the reason why we experience so much contrast in our lives. Joy comes from an understanding of what it's like not to live with joys. But having said that, I think for me too, in some ways, I always resonated with boys when I was growing up. I was a bit of a tomboy, and partly it comes from, I do a lot of work in imposter syndrome, as you know, and it comes from very early on knowing my father wanted a son rather than a daughter. So I was the second daughter, and he was very vocal about wanting a son. And my mother tells this beautiful story. I call it beautiful because it's one of those, she keeps repeating it, and it is in a way a beautiful story, but sad as well. He didn't visit her in the hospital for 4 days when she gave birth to me. So he waited 4 days before going to
Wow.
see her.
He was really hurt by that. Wow, that's so interesting.
So talk about having a chip on my shoulder all my life. I was
Mm.
always trying to be the boy he never had in some ways.
Mm.
And part of that, as I said, contrast makes you stronger. What it meant for me is I developed some skills, an aspiration for leadership that maybe I wouldn't have had. I developed some of those masculine traits perhaps as strengths. And for me, my adult life has been about reconnecting to women and finding the value and the beauty and the
Mm.
joy in reconnecting to women. And I've done that through dance, and now particularly, I think that's was the main driver for me wanting to, do this work that I do with you as well. And writing the book on feminine power, it was all about how do we connect back at the incredible, unique traits and unique strengths that women have in that world of men, in that kind of, particularly at work where there's a lot of systems that are more biased towards a masculine way of doing things, a masculine way of doing business. And I always knew that there was something a bit off with that. I knew that women had this strength and power, and that feminine ways of working and doing things was an alternative, but there was a real taboo in even talking about femininity. I did my PhD on gendered psychology and women at work. And back then, when I was studying gendered psychology, there was a taboo in talking about femininity. Femininity was described as passive and all about the soft qualities, not
Mm.
applicable to the world of business or not applicable to leadership. Whereas all the masculine traits and strengths were about leading and doing, well in business. And I knew that was wrong. I
Mm.
knew that there was something wrong with that.
It was almost like, yeah, you can only lead through the masculine way and then no other way.
That's right. That's right. That's right.
Feminine is
Exactly.
not leadership.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's not
Exactly.
based on ego. Yeah, it's not good or
Yeah.
effective. Yeah.
Yeah. And yet when you look even on the world stage, the leaders who lead through that hyper masculinity, they cause so much destruction and chaos in the world. And whereas leaders that lead through more nurturing, compassionate, collective, collaborative ways of leading, like ex Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern from New Zealand, and maybe even I think Barack Obama, he was probably someone who had more balanced leadership across masculine and
Yeah,
feminine.
he was the
You might
one.
disagree.
He was
You would
he
agree
was
with?
the one who popped into my mind as well when you
Yeah,
about the balance. Like he,
yeah, yeah.
yeah, more.
And you can see that they brought people together around values, and you can see a divided world when leaders lead from that hyper masculine sort of way. So yeah, so I've got this kind of passion about and not just at work, because women lead in their lives, they lead in their families. It's not just about what we do at work.
I was just going to say, just to kind of follow on that, it's interesting, Rad, because we always associate the feminine with women only, whereas feminine
Yes.
is the energy. It is present
Yeah,
in men and in women, and it's
that's right.
okay to integrate those traits for men to have those
That's
feminine
right.
and for the woman to have the most masculine traits.
Yeah.
Just, we have this duality within us, but
Mm-mm.
it's not the only part that is for us because
Yeah.
oftentimes
Yeah.
women are we're only allowed to have that one part of the feminine
Exactly.
as opposed to
Exactly.
having more integrated approach or having different parts for her.
And that integration's so important for healing, and balance for life. When I was doing my PhD, one of the really important books that I read was from a philosopher from the 60s, actually, called David Bakan. And he had this view about human evolution. A lot of people might have heard of Maslow as someone or Jung, Carl Jung, who talks about actualization and,
Yeah.
being an adult and what it means, what kind of evolutionary or development path we go through. Whereas he was kind of in that group of scientists, but he said that biological women and men are born in some ways a blank slate, but there's socialization that happens. We expect little girls to do certain things and we expect little boys to do certain things. So through that socialization, girls are more likely to prefer those more feminine traits because they're getting reinforced, and boys are more likely to prefer those more masculine traits. But as we grow into adulthood, so imagine men masculinity here and females and with femininity here, the development arc for women is to master the balance by integrating some more masculine traits. Whereas for men, the development mastery is about integrating more feminine traits. So in the end, we all end up here. We
Yeah.
all end up with a balanced, integrated, broader perspective of what it means to be human, with feminine and masculine energies playing
Yeah.
together in a way.
Exactly. And that's the type of archetypical work that we're teaching in our retreats, how to become that woman that is able to
Yeah.
integrate those different parts within her that signify that
Mm,
womanhood, or the feminine
yeah.
energy, because feminine energy has different parts to it as well, based on Carl Jung principles of his archetypes that he's
That's
developed.
right.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
right. Now I know that you've done a lot of reading on Carl Jung and thinking about it, and that's because you've developed four archetypes of femininity. How did you get interested in Carl Jung? Why was it Carl Jung for you? Because when you study psychology, you either love Freud or Jung, and it's two. For me, it's like two types of people. You're either Carl Jung or a Freud girl.
Well, I think because Carl Jung integrated the feminine within him, that's what we've just talked about. Whereas
Yeah.
Freud he has this kind of absolutism within him, dogmatism, and he believed that because the experiences he's had, that everybody else has had them, and he's developed these crazy theories based on that. So Jung was a little bit more gentle for me.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
made more sense, when you read about the archetypes. They are these universal patterns that are
Mm,
presented in stories, mythologies,
mm,
songs. Yeah, we're just within us.
mm,
It's innate. It's something that we have. So
mm.
that really resonated with me.
Yeah. Yeah. I really loved the Jung work as well. And I loved the concept of collective unconsciousness, or collective consciousness, I should say. So interesting that I call that unconsciousness. It kind of is at the unconscious level. That was a Freudian slip there.
I love that.
But that collective consciousness, which says that we're all, this was actually the secret before we heard about the secret, we can all access knowledge which is beyond us, because we're all tapped into some kind of collective knowledge, which comes from our evolutionary history. It comes from our environment. It comes from sensing the world around us and each other, and the social knowledge we gain from the non-verbal social knowledge we gain. So I really loved that concept. When I remember being at uni and hearing about collective consciousness, and I thought, wow, this is a big idea.
Yeah, yeah. I was always
So
interested in, accessing the collective consciousness and also the subconscious parts within you.
mm,
Because oftentimes, what makes the consciousness is also those unconscious parts or that
exactly.
knowledge.
Yeah. Yeah. Why were you interested in subconscious? Do you remember at the time what it was about that idea that really, you know, that resonated?
Yeah, well, you know, Carl Jung talks a lot about the subconscious, and the fathers of psychology. They were the one who discovered the subconscious mind,
Yeah.
also put it into a concept. Interestingly enough, I was about
Mm.
12 years old, and I was always interested in spirituality.
Mm.
And when I was 12 years old, I was buying these different books that you could kind of, you had like a flyer coming home, and then you would circle stuff what you want. Back in the days, there was no internet. That was for me ability to access knowledge through that was not allowed, or that was not accessible through libraries or the schooling system.
Mm.
So I was, there were all kinds of interesting books in
Mm-mm.
that flyer. So I purchased hypnotherapy, or a book about hypnosis. It was really, actually, really heavy read for a 12-year-old.
I can imagine.
Spirituality and, the kind of the other side, or something, greater outside of us,
Mm.
the collective conscious, let's say. That was always
Mm-mm.
something I was really, really drawn to. So
Mm-mm.
when I read that book, then I've discovered, okay, there is this subconscious part and what it is, and then how does it link to the dreams, and
Yes.
how we can connect to that subconscious part, and what can it teach us about our
Yeah.
teach us? How can we
Yeah.
help us? How can we elevate our life and our current knowledge by accessing this
Mm-mm.
deeper state, the more depth that we
Yeah.
have within us?
Yeah, and I think that's very much who you are. You like to go deep on things, I think, Petra. Having said that, you can go light. You and I have had lots of really beautiful light
Right
moments. We
moment,
go and
yeah.
have a great time. But I think that's where, yeah, I really love about you. You
Mm.
can you like to go deep. It's a curious mind you have, I think.
Yeah, I think so.
And I think too, it's interesting. Dreams is something that I've always, and spirituality too, I've always been interested in. And dreams is a bit of additional knowledge to the awakened state. I'm always interested in sort of that
Mm.
dream state. But those things, so, science and psychology have always been in, for me, and I know for you, in parallel to mysticism and spirituality. I think you and I travel that parallel pretty well. Not many people do, but I think you and I do that really well. And what I see there is because we have an evidence base. We understand the science, and we talk a lot about integrity, keeping our integrity around that, which is important. But then we also, it's almost like have a faith around spirituality, and I don't see those things as in conflict, actually.
No, I can't understand how people see it. It is as a duality, you know.
Yeah, yeah,
It's
yeah.
it's so intertwined.
Yeah, but I think sometimes people that follow a spiritual path, and I'm not going to generalize, but I've met some people that follow a spiritual path and they dismiss science, and I think that's, you don't need to dismiss science because you follow a spiritual path.
Yeah.
They're very aligned. I recently, on my other podcast, Teen Culture and You, I interviewed a guy called Topa Tyler who did some research at Stanford University. And he's a creative who then did a PhD. So he was a executive producer of children's television,
Mm.
done that for decades in Hollywood, very famous shows. I don't have children, so I don't know the shows that he was talking about, but he was saying if you had children, you'd know. So I'm thinking it's something to do with a turtle. But anyway, but he did some research at Stanford which demonstrated scientifically, using a double blind study, the efficacy of positive intention on performance. So he had a double blind study where he had a swim crew at the University of Stanford, and someone like a shaman conducting positive intention towards that swim crew, as well as something that is a more mechanical way of doing that, so more of an automated 24/7 way of doing that. And and the swimmers didn't know who was receiving positive intention and who wasn't, so there was double blind, and the researchers collecting the data didn't know. And what they found was that the swimmers who were receiving those positive intentions did significantly better in performance. And what we mean by performance there was, he specifically broke it down to, length of swim stroke and speed in the water. And, because in swimming you can calculate the minutiae of everything, from what your body's doing to the time. It's not just the time in the water, it's how efficient you are in the water. And I was really intrigued by that study because it uses scientific methodology to prove out what we've been talking about in
Yeah.
spirituality around manifestation, around positive thought.
And that collective consciousness. Yeah.
Exactly, exactly. And especially because there was no contact between the swimmers and the sources of this
Yeah.
positive
Yeah.
intention.
There's no
And in
like.
fact, that swim team went on to win the state championships or whatever. The whole team
Mm.
did well. So I think that's what we bring. I think is particularly um, that science to the spirituality, and vice versa. I think, like you, I bring spirituality to my science sometimes as well. And we travel the parallel, because it's, for me, it's not a either or, it's an and,
Yeah.
spirituality and that scientific path.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, I'll look forward to some more conversations where, Petra, what we're breaking down some of the concepts that we we work in, particularly in the retreat, and some of the things that we do, but also maybe even we can talk about um, how we're applying things in our daily life and what we're experiencing, because I think all of that is really useful and interesting as we're talking to other women and men. Because to your point, I'd be really interested in reaching out to men who really want to, go up that arc that David McCann was talking about, integrate more femininity in
Mm.
their lives. For example, my partner Spiro, he's been learning about 10 months ago, he decided he needed to go through some personal development. The way he decided to do it was he took up dancing and karate. So, through both of those things, I'm noticing he's getting more connected with his vulnerability and his femininity, because in karate, there's a lot of vulnerability that comes into
Yeah,
play in that practice, overcoming that vulnerability,
yeah,
a lot of discipline and vulnerability. And
and
in
practice the
dancing, of
ego
course,
as well.
yeah, exactly. In both dancing and karate, you have to let go of ego.
Yeah.
Absolutely. You have to be the student as well. So it's fascinating to watch him. And I
Mm.
think he's doing, shout out to Spirit, I think he's doing really well. And he decided that that was his way of wanting to be a better man.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
Yeah, yeah,
Oftentimes,
yeah.
these different practices do allow us to integrate these new energies. Doesn't always have to be a
That's right.
therapy, or
No, that's
you know,
right.
it could be just this kind of somatic experience that you do. And we do a lot of those in our retreat as well.
We do. We do. So we might break it down next time we chat. Let's break down a little bit of what we do at the retreat, and then I think we can go into some topics, particularly around. I'd love to hear more about the hypnotherapy that you do, Petra, and we'll talk a little bit more about the somatic movement that we do, as well as some of the other activities, which I think are fabulous. Thanks, Petra. It's going to be a pleasure having these conversations with you. I'm looking
I
forward
can't
to it.
wait. I've really
Yeah.
enjoyed this.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Good.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, honey. We'll talk soon. Ciao.